The cliffs of Skye hid more than sea winds and silence. Beneath their jagged edge lay a body, and behind that fall, a truth buried for decades. MissMarple didn't just come for tea. She came to untangle a village where grief had learned to wear a smile. The train had been delayed in Inverness, and by the time the motorcar reached the windswept road that curled like a ribbon along the cliffs of the Isle of Skye, the afternoon was beginning its quiet descent into that northern twilight, which came too early and lingered too long. MissMarple, wrapped in her traveling shawl and clutching a small carpet bag, looked out the window of the vehicle with quiet curiosity. The sea, slate-gray and restless, beat steadily against jagged rocks below. The landscape was breathtaking in its bleakness. Windswept moors, low stone walls, and houses set wide apart as if wary of each other. She was not one to travel often, but when her old school friend Lavinia Armitage had written in a careful, almost lonely hand suggesting a visit to break up the winter and provide company on the long evenings, MissMarple had accepted with the mild gratitude of the aged, who still believed in answering friendship with kindness. As they descended into the village of Kilbeath, MissMarple noticed the curious hush that blanketed the place. Not merely the silence of remoteness, but the kind breath of caution. A man with a wheelbarrow paused mid-motion to observe them. A woman at her garden gate averted her gaze, and the mist, ever-present and patient, crept around roof lines as if listening in. The man was handsome, if we structure, built of stone, so dark it seemed perpetually damp. Within the fire crackled with effort, and Lavinia Armitage, taller now, with streaks of iron in her once flaxen hair, greeted MissMarple with a warmth that skirted the edges of weariness. They sat over tea in the drawing-room, where the windows looked out upon the moors. Lavinia spoke of village matters with a stiffness that belied a deeper strain. Her maid, Morag, silent and sharp-eyed, moved about with the sort of careful quiet MissMarple had only ever seen in houses where something had been endured, not said. "There's been rather a solemn air about the place these months," Lavinia admitted, offering shortbread. "It isn't only the weather." She did not elaborate. MissMarple merely nodded and tucked the information away, as she always did. The news came early the next morning. MissMarple, seated near the window with her knitting, heard Lavinia's sharp intake of breath in the hallway as Morag whispered something hurriedly. Moments later, Lavinia entered the room, face pale, kettle forgotten, in her hand. "Dr. Gower. He's been found down by the cliffs." MissMarple set down her needles. It was the ville's only doctor, Malcolm Gowrie, who had been discovered by the boy, Colin Fraser, while tending to sheep near the southern cliff path. MissMarple accompanied Lavinia to the site, more by instinct than invitation. The boy stood off to one side, had clutched in his hands, and the constable was already taking notes with the practiced air of someone who had no reason to suspect foul play. "They say he must have slipped," Lavinia murmured, but MissMarple's eyes were not on the rocks or the body. They followed the line of the cliff's edge and the patch of flattened earth near a gorse bush where a struggle might have begun or ended. The doctor, she had already been told, was a creature of habit. He walked the same cliff path each morning, always with his heavy walking stick, a gift from a patient, engraved in silver at the hilt. But as the constable listed out the belongings found on the body, no mention was made of it. MissMarple asked gently, "And the stick, Sergeant?" "I was told he never walked far without it." The man blinked, then frowned. "Didn't see one. Might have fallen into the sea." "Might have." MissMarple glanced again at the body. The arms were at an odd angle, almost too even in their repose, as though arranged rather than thrown, and there was no soil on the palms. A curious thing for a man said to have stumbled forward. She said nothing further, only nodded, but her thoughts began to settle like dust inside a seldom-used drawer. A man might fall certainly, but when a stick goes missing, and hands bear no sign of instinctive grasping, one begins to wonder who else was present when gravity took its toll. Later that day, MissMarple offered to post a letter for Lavinia. The village post office was tucked into a low stone cottage near the vicarage. Its sign faded, its windows curtained. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and barley sugar. The postmistress, a stout woman named Mrs. Ferguson, accepted the envelope with the sort of hush one might expect in a funeral parlor. When Miss Marple remarked gently on the tragedy, the woman gave a tight nod. "Shocking, of course," she said, eyes not meeting hers. "Though some might say, not altogether. Unexpected." "Oh," said Miss Marple, in her usual fluttering tone. "Surely such a thing is always a surprise." Mrs. Ferguson adjusted the stamps in the drawer with unnecessary focus. "He had his ways, the doctor. Some found him difficult, but we don't speak ill of the dead." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, and yet silence can say so much." When she left, she paused at the doorway, glancing back only once. Behind the counter, Mrs. Ferguson was still, her mouth set in the careful line of a woman who had once decided to stop speaking, and had not broken the habit since. It was the sort of tea-gathering Miss Marple had seen, replicated in every corner of England. China cups placed precisely, laced doilies under seed cake, and the gentle murmur of voices lowered not by shyness, but by habit. The drawing-room of the manse, with its oak panels and ancestral portraits, offered just the right air of gentle shadow for unspoken things to drift to the surface. Mrs. Dill, a woman of wide girth and measured words, nibbled her shortbread delicately, though her eyes glittered with untold thoughts. Miss Brodie, sharper in both manner and cheekbone, stirred her tea with the studied precision of one who disapproves of tremors in others. "Of course, it's a dreadful business," said Mrs. Dalzell, setting down her cup. But then, he was not a man to inspire softness. Lavinia cast a glance at Miss Marple before replying. "No, he wasn't exactly warm, was he?" "No," Miss Brodie agreed. "And warmth has nothing to do with competence, I suppose. Still, there are those who say he was rather too quick with judgment, especially where the weak were concerned." Miss Marple sipped her tea without comment. It was a truth long learned in St. Mary, Maine. Death rarely extinguished the opinions of the living. It merely gave them permission to speak more freely. "It was the Ferguson baby," said Miss Brodie in a low voice, leaning forward just enough to show that what followed had remained unspoken for far too long. 17 years ago now. The child had a fever, and the mother begged him to stay the night. He refused, saying it was a matter for the morning. "And the baby died before dawn," murmured Mrs. Dill. "Poor Margaret Ferguson never forgave him, not properly, though one wouldn't know it to see her ringing the church bells." Miss Marple, still silent, noted the slight tightening of Lavinia's mouth. "He always had the right word for why something wasn't his fault," added Miss Brodie. "Very clean hands, Dr. Gowry. Always washed, always folded. But one cannot wash away regret." It was spoken without malice, but with the weariness of long-kept memory, the sort of wound that fades from sight, but continues to throb in sudden weather. And now the doctor was dead, not mourned, not wept for, not even, Miss Marple suspected, entirely missed. What a curious thing when the loss of a man created more relief than sorrow. "I wonder," said Lavinia, lifting her cup, "whether anyone has written to Mary Carmichael." The name drew a pause across the gathering. Miss Brodie gave a slight tilt of her head, as if sensing something sour. "Mary," said Mrs. Deal. "I thought she was living in Inverness. Or was it further north?" "Far enough to not return," said Lavinia. "She was close to him once, and helped him after the war. They were never formal about it, but there were whispers." "Of course there were," Miss Brodie said crisply. She was young and spirited, and perhaps not quite careful enough with affection. Miss Marple observed the ripple in the room that followed. Her name returned after absence, unspoken for years, now waiting again. There had been some bond between Mary and Dr. Gowry, a professional closeness perhaps, nursing, clerical work, but also something deeper, something less spoken. She had left, and no one had asked why aloud, which often meant that everyone already knew, except the one woman who never assumed anything without examining it closely. It was the next day when Lavinia mentioned the McCrims. They owned a substantial portion of the land south of the village. The wind swept moor that sloped down toward the sea. Alistair McCrimmon, the eldest son, ran the farm now, though the matriarch still ruled in whispers and frowns from a kitchen window. They had words with Dr. Gowry some time ago. Lavinia said he'd advised the council against expanding their pasture lease, citing soil erosion, but there were whispers that he had other reasons. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. It said he was in talks to purchase that parcel himself, Lavinia added, looking vaguely embarrassed by the suggestion. Or perhaps for someone else. But it was all very quiet. And then the matter was dropped. Land meant legacy in places like Kilbeath. Soil and stone passed down through blood, and any threat to that chain, however slight, left marks deeper than any legal boundary. Miss Marple made a mental note. A temper such as a Leicester's combined with old resentments and thwarted land claims was never quite buried, merely pressed under the weight of civility. The retired Major Ashford lived in a modest stone cottage near the War Memorial. A man of rigid posture and fixed routine, he walked daily to the village green and back, his cane striking the path with military precision. Miss Marple encountered him by design rather than chance, having made an excuse to deliver a borrowed book from Lavinia. The conversation predictably turned to the doctor. "Gower," the Major said, his face tightening. "Cold as the sea in February. Never believed in shell shock. I called it weakness." He did not look at her as he spoke, but his fingers resting on the knob of his cane whitened slightly. "I once asked him for something. Not for myself, for a lad in the village. Said he was having night terrors. Gowrie said he needed labor, not lord. The boy took his own life 2 weeks later." There was a pause. The Major cleared his throat. Still, no one called it murder, and Gowrie kept making his rounds. Miss Marple thanked him politely, but as she walked away, she felt a heaviness settle behind her eyes. Wounds left untreated fester, and the village had long learned to live around pain that had been politely ignored. It was over supper when Morag served a comforting lamb stew that Lavinia casually recalled something that made Miss Marple lower her spoon midair. "Dr. Gowrie always wore that medal," Lavinia said. "You remember it, don't you? On a chain with his watch. Silver, French, I believe. Something from the war." Miss Marple did remember. She had not known its origin, but she recalled its dull gleam on his waistcoat, not flamboyant, but unmistakable. "I didn't see it mentioned among his belongings," Miss Marple said lightly. "No," Lavinia frowned. "Now that you say it, I suppose it's not been spoken of. A man might fall to his death. He might even lose a stick in the sea. But for a chain of that sort to vanish, one carried daily, deliberately, seemed more than happenstance." Miss Marple did not speak of her suspicion. She had learned long ago that secrets rarely yield to the forceful knock. Better always to let them come quietly to the surface, like oil rising from depth. And in Kilbath, the sea held more than salt in its undertow. There was something hidden here, something not quite natural about how death had claimed a man so broadly unloved, and how in dying he had left behind a silence too curated to be accidental. Colin Fraser was not a talkative boy by nature, 17, perhaps 18, with a fair shock of hair and the self-sufficiency that comes from working with sheep in all weather. He had little need for idle words. But when Miss Marple found him mending a gate on the edge of the pasture, he looked up, nodded respectfully, and paused his work. "I heard you found the doctor," she said gently enough. He nodded again, eyes down. Didn't look right. Not the way he was lying, like someone had placed him there. "And did you see him the day before?" Colin hesitated. Then, with the careful honesty of the young, he said, "I near the cliffs, same path. He was talking to a woman, brown coat, headscarf. Not close enough to hear, but she raised her hand at him. Not gently." Miss Marple tucked this away. "Did you recognize her?" He hesitated once more, then gave a reluctant nod. "Reckon it were Mary Carmichael. Used to work for him. Went away years ago." His voice softened. "I liked the doctor. He helped me with my leg. Didn't charge my mom. But folk didn't always see him like I did." It was said with that quiet grace Miss Marple knew well. The first crack in the surface of a portrait, too long painted in black and white. Mary Carmichael lived in a stone croft half, swallowed by the hill behind it. It had the look of a place chosen not for its beauty, but its distance from others. When Miss Marple arrived with a borrowed knitting pattern as pretext, Mary opened the door with weariness clouded by fatigue. "I remember you," Mary said after a moment. "You're Lavinia's guest." They sat indoors, the peat fire muttering in the hearth. It was not long before the subject turned delicately to Dr. Gowry. "He helped me once," Mary said, eyes fixed on the fire. "Taught me how to keep his ledgers. Let me stay in the rooms above the practice. And then you left," MissMarple said softly. Mary's hand tightened around her teacup. "He sent a letter to the man I was engaged to. Said I was not suitable, fragile, unwell." "And were you?" Mary's mouth trembled into something like a smile. "Not until he wrote it." There was no anger in her voice, only something heavier, some sadness that had grown used to its shape, like a stone fitted into the palm after years of turning. Major Ashford received MissMarple in his parlor, a room filled with stiff furniture and dust-free metals. He wore his uniform jacket even at home, though the cuffs were frayed and the shoulders hung loosely on his thinner frame. Their conversation wandered as these things do until it circled gently to the matter of Dr. Gowry. "A clever man," said the Major, his voice clipped, decisive. "That was his charm and his cruelty." MissMarple watched his hand as he reached for a glass. How it paused, trembled slightly, then resumed. He didn't believe in what he couldn't treat with tonic and a spoon. The Major continued, and he thought anyone who wept was indulging himself. MissMarple said nothing. The Major cleared his throat. "We lost good men to bullets and better men to silence. Gower only ever attended to the former. It was said without theatrical bitterness, but with the authority of someone who had watched a slow death, the kind no doctor ever certified." As she left, MissMarple noticed the crumpled glove by the door. A military man never misplaced his kit, but the past, she had learned, scattered itself in the most undisciplined ways. As MissMarple walked through Kilbeath in the days that followed, those quiet remarks, half-glances, and reluctant confessions began to draw together, not as lines of accusation, but as tangled threads of consequence. Mary had spoken of a ruined engagement. The Major had spoken of men left unacknowledged in their suffering. And Colin, young as he was, carried the doctor's kindness like a fragile token passed down through a chain of harsher dealings. All had known Dr. Gower in a different light, and all had been marked for better or worse by his decisions. MissMarple recalled a story from her own youth in St. Mary Me of a schoolmaster who prided himself on discipline, and whose cruelties were only seen clearly once his desk lay empty. He had meant well, or so they'd said, but meaning is a poor defense against the wounds one leaves behind. More curiously, there had been references to things said but not detailed, hints of debts unpaid, favors granted or withdrawn. And in all this, a subtle change had come upon the village, an easing of restraint, a slow uncoiling. The doctor's death had not simply removed a man. It had opened the cupboard where the past had been stored away, and now dust stirred in corners no one had wished to revisit. At the vicarage tea, where conversation floated lightly between him and the price of wool, MissMarple noted how certain names brought sudden pauses. The way Mrs. Dalzell glanced toward the floor when Mary Carmichael's name was mentioned, the stiffening of Lavinia's hands when the Major walked past their garden gate. These silences, small, almost imperceptible, were never hostile, but they held a force far weightier than the words people dared speak aloud. MissMarple had long known that pain, when buried, left its mark not through speech, but through the effort people made to avoid it. Everyone in Kilbeath seemed to have been shaped by Dr. Gowry's proximity, and yet no one seemed capable of saying clearly who he truly was, what he had done or failed to do or promised and withdrawn. Like a shadow at a window, his presence had lingered even in absence, and now in death he seemed more alive than ever, echoed in glances, in cautions unspoken, in sorrow that looked like composure. MissMarple did not need confessions. She had always known the truth of a person lies less in what is said than in what causes them to fall suddenly, cautiously silent. That evening, MissMarple sat with her knitting in the parlor, while the wind pulled gently at the corners of the old manse. The click of her needles was steady, but her thoughts wandered to another time, another village. She had known men like Dr. Gower before, men who had been shaped by war, not by blood or shelling, but by the habits of self-denial, of quick decisions, of seeing suffering as a symptom to be treated or ignored. Some had returned from the Great War, kinder, more broken, more capable of tenderness. Others, like Gowry, had returned harder. They had shut the door to feeling and thrown away the key. She remembered a boy in St. Mary Me back in 1919 who used to scream in his sleep and was told to hold himself together. He'd done just that until one spring morning when he walked into the woods and never came back. Now, decades later in this village by the sea, she saw the same echoes, different names, different fates, but the same pattern of hurt left unanswered. And she began to wonder, not who had killed Dr. Gowrie, but who had lived too long under his shadow. It was Lavinia who handed Miss Marple the letter. She had found it tucked into the back of a hill in the third pew from the front, one of the older ones used only on high feast days. Miss Marple unfolded it gently, noting the faded ink and the worn paper edges, too carefully folded to be discarded by accident. "It's not signed," Lavinia murmured, "but the hand is unmistakable. It's Gallery's." Miss Marple read it in silence. The words were spare, the tone oddly formal, detached even, but one sentence lingered like a bruise. "I did what I thought was right, but the girl in one deserved better. Reparation is owed, though perhaps it is too late to offer it with clean hands." There was no date, no recipient, but it was clearly a confession of sorts, not guilt precisely. Dr. Gowrie had not the temperament for dramatic admissions, but something that passed for conscience in a man so ruled by discipline. Own, a name that sounded like sea winds and forgotten things. Miss Marple folded the letter again and handed it back. "Do you suppose," she said mildly, "that the good doctor had been trying of late to put a few old things in order?" Lavinia said nothing, but the silence between them shifted as though a door had quietly unlocked. The McCrimmon farm stood high on the northern slope, battered by winds and marked by a crooked fence that seemed permanently in need of mending. Miss Marple came under the pretext of purchasing eggs, her ruse accepted without question by the pale and tight-lipped Alasdair. He led her to the kitchen where an older woman, his mother, gray-haired and shrunken by grief more than age, set down a basket with trembling hands. "You'll forgive the dust," she said softly, though there was none. "It settles here faster than we can sweep." Miss Marple made a gentle remark about weather and chickens, but the conversation turned, as it often did in Kilbeath, to Dr. Gowrie. "He was a learned man," said Mrs. McCrimmon, "not always a kind one." Alasdair did not speak. He stared instead at the moors, as though watching something only he could see. "A loss was suffered here," Miss Marple said later to Lavinia as they walked home. "One the doctor was part of, but perhaps never truly paid for. And the McCrimmons, they speak as people who carry grief like a ritual, worn and unspoken, but sacred." The story came from Miss Brodie over tea with a seed cake that had gone stale at the edges. She did not volunteer it quickly, but after some gentle inquiries from Miss Marple, she folded her napkin and said almost reluctantly, "There was a boy, Hamish, a Leicester's younger brother, fell ill after a school excursion, fever, something sudden." Miss Marple nodded, her expression untouched by surprise. "Gower was called, of course, said it was nothing serious. Left instructions with the mother and went on to Inness for a conference. The child died before dawn. No inquiry. None. It was explained as a rare complication. Something in the lungs, I believe." Miss Brodie paused, but those who knew the family said the mother changed after that, dressed in darker colors, never sang again in church. And Alasdair, he never left the farm after that, never married, never looked beyond the fields. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. In villages, grief did not shout. It folded itself into habits, into the way one walked past a room, into the sound of a name no longer said. And the doctor, respected though he was, had left something terribly undone. Miss Marple happened upon Mr. W.Y., the village solicitor, in the post-office queue, a man of starched collars and the sort of self-importance that renders discretion unevenly distributed. He was murmuring to Mrs. Ferguson, who looked politely uncomfortable, when Miss Marple, with her usual gentility, greeted him and asked whether the weather had interfered with his Sunday walk. "Not at all," he replied. "I enjoy the sea air. Clears the mind. Though I must say I didn't expect to be called upon by the late Dr. Gowrie just last week. Wanted a consultation about his will. Urgent, he said. Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes remained on the letter she was holding. Did he mention any changes? W.Y. chuckled. Not directly, but he had that purposeful tone of someone who's decided to do something unusual, unorthodox even. And just like that, the solicitor, realizing he'd said too much, flushed and excused himself. Miss Marple said nothing, but the threads were tightening. Gower had died days after seeking to amend his affairs. And in Kilbath, few things stirred more quietly dangerous feelings than the fear of being disinherited or replaced. It began, as most village whispers do, with something harmless, a remark about a resemblance, a question that hung in the air too long. "I always thought that Colin Fraser looked rather like someone," said Mrs. Dalzell over scone, not quite aware she'd spoken aloud. "Not his mother, mind you." Miss Marple folded her napkin with care. "No. And who then?" Mrs. Dalziel blinked. "Well, now you've made me think of it. I couldn't quite say." The matter might have ended there had not Miss Marple stopped at the manse's small library later that day and drawn Lavinia into a discussion about wartime billeting. Lavinia, tired from sorting papers, let slip something unexpected. Gower was stationed in Oban for a time, wasn't he? Just before he settled here, there was talk of a girl. She died, I believe, in childbirth. And the child? Miss Marple asked lightly. Lavinia looked surprised. No one ever said. I assumed the child was sent off or placed in care. People didn't speak of such things. But now people were beginning to, not with judgment, but with something close to curiosity, perhaps even sympathy. A child born of silence, a doctor who could not say the word son, and a shepherd boy with kind eyes, and a past no one had ever thought to ask about. That evening, as dusk gathered across the moors, and the wind pushed softly at the windows, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting and thought of the things parents do not say. She had known it in St. Mary, Maine. Fathers who could not look their daughters in the eye after sending them away to quiet houses in London. Mothers who pressed family photographs flat in albums so the faces would not rise too high. Guilt, when softened by time, becomes not lighter, but better hidden. Dr. Gowry, for all his intelligence, had lacked the courage to speak the truth while there was still time. Perhaps he had tried at the end. Perhaps the letter in the hymnal was an attempt at restitution and the call to the solicitor, a final act of conscience. But shame casts long shadows, and when the truth is buried deep enough, it is not only the guilty who pay for silence, but those left behind to wonder who they are and what they were meant to be. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The threads were drawing close now. The pattern, faint but insistent, was beginning to show. The fire was seen first by Colin Fraser. He had risen early, as shepherds do, and saw the glow not of dawn, but of something more urgent, a pulsing light to the east, flickering behind the silhouette of Mary Carmichael's croft. By the time help arrived, the roof had given way in places, and smoke curled upward in long, ragged spirals. Mary was found just inside the threshold, face blackened, her frame unconscious, and crumpled in the soot. It was a miracle, said the constable, that she had survived at all. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the commotion, her shawl drawn close against the wind. Lavinia had fetched her in haste, and though the villagers moved with alarm, Miss Marple merely observed, eyes narrowing slightly at the unusual intensity of the blaze. Later, as the embers cooled, murmurs began. The fire, they said, had started near the hearth, but the flames had spread too fast, too well, unnatural, almost rehearsed. Mary was taken to the vicarage to recover. She remained unconscious, breathing in ragged fits. Mrs. Dalzell stood watch, stern and efficient. Miss Marple did not speak, but inside a new awareness took root. This was no accident. The stillness of Kilbeath had cracked open, and something desperate had taken hold in its place. By noon, the constable had returned from the ruins with news. In the remains of a scorched chest of drawers, miraculously preserved from full collapse, something metallic had been found. Miss Marple was present when it was placed on Lavinia's kitchen table. A tarnished silver watch chain melted slightly at the clasp, but still recognizable. The chain Dr. Gowry had always worn, the one conspicuously absent from his person when he was found at the foot of the cliffs. The room was silent. Even Morag, usually impervious to shock, seemed momentarily still. Proof, the constable muttered. She must have taken it. Likely during a struggle, guilt or greed. Perhaps both. Miss Marple said nothing. She leaned closer to the chain and noted how cleanly it had escaped the full force of the fire, as though it had not been in the chest for long, as though it had been placed there just before the flames began. Outside, rumors bloomed like bramble. Mary, jilted and furious, exacting some final revenge, or worse, concealing a theft long planned. The village, ever hungry for shape to its unease, had found a story to cling to. But Miss Marple, standing by the hearth, listened not to stories, but to silences. It was 2 days later when the arrest was made. Mary, pale and still weakened from smoke, had barely regained her strength when the constable arrived with a folded slip of paper and a weary expression masked his certainty. "Mary Carmichael," he announced, "I am obliged to place you under arrest for suspicion of theft and murder concerning the death of Dr. Malcolm Gowrie." Miss Marple, seated by the window in Lavinia's parlor, watched as Mary said nothing. No protest, no tear, only a single breath, quiet and thin, as if the air had left her long ago. The constable explained it all with firm logic. A long-standing bitterness, a motive drawn from a ruined past, opportunity via proximity, and now physical evidence. The silver chain, the fire, the collapse, it all, he said. Fit. Miss Marple stirred her teacup gently, as if aligning the world in its orbit. Fit, she murmured when they had gone. Yes, but do we dress the facts to fit the shape we expect? Or do we at times stitch the story too hastily to keep ourselves warm against the chill of doubt? No one replied, but the wind at the window whistled a kind of agreement. It came to her not through soothing, but memory. Miss Marple had been sipping broth that Lavinia insisted upon when a small detail flickered to the surface, like something remembered from a childhood rhyme. Colin had mentioned in passing that the McCrimmon sheep dog had barked furiously the night of the doctor's death, enough to wake him, but not toward the cliffs, the boy had said, not where they found the body. She was barking at the east field toward the track. At the time the remark had seemed peripheral, merely the commentary of someone unused to tragic events. But now Miss Marple reconsidered. Dogs, after all, do not reason. They react. And they react to movement, to sound, to scent. If Gowrie had fallen from the cliffs in solitude, what had disturbed the dog so violently in the other direction? She sat very still, her hands folded. In a village as small as Kilbeath, with its lanes and sheep paths and invisible fences of custom and silence, even a dog's bark could carry the weight of contradiction. And contradiction, in Miss Marple's experience, was often the first whisper of truth. It was not indignation that stirred within Miss Marple. She had never been one for outrage, but as she sat beside Lavinia that afternoon, listening to the village murmur its verdict in the safety of parlors and post-queues, she felt a familiar, quiet resolve settle over her. Mary Carmichael had become the answer simply because her name was easy to whisper. Her past, her solitude, her former closeness to the doctor, they all made her ideal. A story that required no effort to believe. Yet everything Miss Marple had seen, heard, and remembered whispered another rhythm. The letter hidden in the hymnal, the solicitor's careless remark, the chain placed too precisely, the barking dog. And then there was Mary herself. Miss Marple had seen desperation before, real jagged-edged despair. Mary did not possess it. Her silences were not those of a woman broken by guilt. They were the silences of someone long accustomed to not being heard. She is useful to them, Miss Marple said quietly to Lavinia, because she does not fight. Do you think she's innocent? I think she's been convenient, Miss Marple replied. But the truth is rarely convenient. It is merely patient. And that truth, like morning mist, was beginning to take form, thin and luminous over the moors. Miss Marple had always believed in dust. It settled eventually, even in the finest houses and on the best-kept shelves. And in truth, so did facts, if one waited long enough. Now, in the growing quiet after the arrest, she sensed something else settling. Not chaos, but design. The suddenness of the fire, timed just before Mary regained footing. The chain placed not carefully enough. The solicitor's story of a will never completed. The strange silence at the McCrimmon farm. All too sudden, too neat. This was not the frenzy of guilt. It was the care of someone trying to tidy the edges. Miss Marple had learned over many years that people rarely conceal crimes. They conceal emotions, shame, resentment, envy. The crimes are merely the shadows cast by those feelings. Now, with a new clarity, she began to trace the faint outline of something not yet spoken, her grief misplaced, her fear of loss, and a careful attempt to preserve legacy by removing one inconvenient truth at a time. The village, hushed and compliant, might not yet see it, but Miss Marple, as always, was listening. Miss Marple's journey to Oban was not made lightly. It required a train from Inverness and a hired car from the harbor, but she made the trip as one would attend an overdue appointment quietly and with a sense of finality. The registrar's office was small, its windows dimmed by sea salt and time. The woman behind the desk, soft-spoken and curious, found the entry with the librarian's reverence. MacPhail Annie, February 1941. Male child, father not listed. The ledger was heavy with ink and space, but the notations told more than they appeared. Miss Marple, peering through her spectacles, saw the shape of what had been left unsaid. Annie MacPhail, her name Lavinia had once mentioned, the girl and one whom Gowrie had wronged. It was not difficult to infer. A doctor in a temporary billet, a young woman alone, a child born into the hush of war. She died later that year, the clerk added, eyes on the paper. Pneumonia. The boy was sent to an orphanage in Glasgow. Miss Marple thanked her, tucked away the copied record, and stepped once more into the wind of the northern town. What had once been a whisper buried in a hymnal had now acquired a name, a date, and a direction. The orphanage had long since closed, its buildings sold to a sanatorium, but the records miraculously had survived, kept in a metal cabinet in a small city archive. A kindly Clare allowed Miss Marple to leaf through the wartime register. There it was. Fraser Collin, born February 1941, transferred from Oban District Hospital, admitted under care of the state, adopted by Margaret Fraser of Kilbeath in 1946. Miss Marple closed the folder slowly. She had suspected as much since Collin first spoke of the doctor with such reverent affection, an admiration that had felt instinctive, almost inherited. But now admiration had shape and a motive too, not for the boy, but for another, one who might have feared what the doctor had come to know. When she returned to Kilbeath, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the stone walls and ridges. Collin passed her on the lane, leading his sheep with his usual patience. He smiled and tipped his cap. Miss Marple returned the gesture with a quiet nod. The child once forgotten had grown into a man unknowing of what was taken from him, and what might have been given had someone not intervened. Once back in Lavinia's parlor, Miss Marple sat quietly before the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. The evidence did not shout, but it no longer whispered either. Dr. Gowrie, so precise in his habits, had consulted a solicitor shortly before his death. He had inquired after changes to his will, and he had retrieved a sum of money. Reasons unspoken, destination unrecorded. Miss Marple now understood why. It was not guilt precisely. Gowrie had never been a man for sentiment, but in the end some weight had pressed upon him. Perhaps he had seen in Collin what others had not. Something in the eyes, in the manner, in the silent integrity of a young man he could never claim aloud. A father's heart, no matter how buried, cannot always be governed by reason. Miss Marple believed that he had wished at last to leave something of value, not merely currency, but recognition, a gesture made late, but made none the less. But intentions have their enemies, and money, when it moves from hand to hand in secret, tends to vanish before reaching its destination. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the firelight, dancing over the teacups. Someone, she now suspected, had ensured that recognition never came. The parish church in Kilbeath was cold even in daylight, its stone walls collecting silence as though it were an obligation. Miss Marple, accompanied by Lavinia under the guise of interest in local architecture, lingered by the old vestry. She asked ever so lightly if she might look through the donations ledger. The vicar, a nervous man who disliked conflict and adored order, obliged with a murmur of assent. The entries were neat, formal, tithes and pew rents, donations from families long settled in the village. But one line near the bottom caught Miss Marple's attention. Anonymous donation £500. Initials M.G. No further note. But the timing, just a week before the doctor's death, was significant. Miss Marple closed the ledger and returned it to the vicar with a smile. The money had been set aside, perhaps not yet given formally, but signaled, a gesture incomplete, a promise half kept. There was a kind of loneliness in the entry, she thought, a last-minute reach toward redemption, recorded by initials alone, half hiding, half acknowledging. Not a bequest, not a legal handover. A father's quiet atonement, slipped between pages no one was meant to read. Miss Marple had always believed that institutions tell their own stories. Banks in particular speak in numbers, but the silences between them reveal the most. She arrived at the Kilbeath branch on the pretext of exchanging notes. A young teller, polite but inattentive, recognized her from the village and spoke with casual ease. "I expect it's been a strange week," she said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I hear the doctor had some business here not long before." The girl nodded. "Yes, rather a large withdrawal. Nearly £1,000, I think. Manager handled it personally. Came in with his doctor's bag as always." Miss Marple thanked her and left. £1,000. Enough for a legacy. Enough to change a young man's station in life. Enough to cause alarm in any house where inheritance was spoken of in whispers. But the money was gone. It had not been found in the doctor's belongings. Not in the house, not on his person. A man who walked with habit and precision would not have mislaid it. She now saw the shape of something colder than accident. The removal not only of a man, but of what he had intended to give. The motive was not rage nor even hate. It was fear of displacement of truth, of a legacy redirected. And in such fear men sometimes do terrible things in quiet, deliberate ways. It was dusk again in Kilbeath when Miss Marple sat with her shawl pulled snug, her eyes on the lamplight flickering in the window panes. Her thoughts, unlike the wind outside, moved with measured certainty. A man had died at the edge of the sea. A woman had been blamed conveniently, rapidly. A child had grown to manhood, never knowing who he truly was. And between these lives, someone else had moved carefully, concealing letters, removing chains, striking matches in the night, not out of passion, but to preserve what they feared might be taken. She saw it now, not a crime of anger, but of calculation, not the chaos of tragedy, but the cold curve of decision. Gowrie had tried in his way to right a wrong, but he had underestimated the weight of inheritance. How deeply it was rooted in the blood and land of Kilba. Miss Marple watched as the mist returned across the fields, gentle and unhurried. The truth had always been there, only it had dressed itself, as it so often did, in the most ordinary habits. A forgotten chain, an unsigned gift, a silence too long maintained. And now the pattern was ready to be spoken aloud. It was late afternoon when Lavinia's drawing-room received its solemn guests, summoned not by formal invitation, but by that peculiar gravity Miss Marple exerted, when her quiet certainty took shape. No one asked why they had been gathered. In Kilbath, where words moved carefully, silence often signified agreement. Alice Dearm Crimmins stood by the fireplace, arms folded, his face set in a stoic mask. Mary Carmichael sat slightly apart, pale but composed, her eyes weary. Colin Fraser summoned without explanation, perched awkwardly on the edge of a chair. The constable stood, not quite understanding his purpose, but unwilling to object. Miss Marple settled neatly in the largest of Lavinia's armchairs, glanced once about the room before folding her hands. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," she began mildly, "but I have always found that truth, like tea, tends to settle when left undisturbed, though only when properly poured." The constable shifted. Alistair's jaw tightened. Miss Marple looked directly at no one, and yet all felt seen. There has been talk. There has been grief. But there has also been misdirection, and if I may say so, something more painful, a silencing of things long buried. And with that she began. Miss Marple's voice was calm, the words chosen not for drama, but for precision. "Dr. Gowrie had his ways," she said, "and many of them did not endear him to this village. But men are not only the sum of their manners. Sometimes they surprise us late in life with unexpected mercies." She turned her gaze gently, but without uncertainty, to Colin. "Your mother was Annie MacPhail of Owen. You were born during the war. The records are quite clear. Dr. Gallery was posted there at the time. Colin's eyes widened, not with outrage, but with something quieter, a disked wonder. MissMarple continued. He never spoke it, but he sought to act. A donation to the church, a solicitor's consultation, a sum withdrawn from the bank. All point to a man preparing to offer what he had long denied. The constable glanced at a Leicester, then back at MissMarple. And why would anyone wish to stop him? MissMarple's eyes lingered on the fading light in the window. Because legacies, emotional and financial, unseat the balance of quiet arrangements, and because the truth, when long denied, can feel like theft to those who've built their lives upon silence. MissMarple's voice lowered slightly, but her words never wavered. It is my belief that Alice McCrimmon came to know of the doctor's intentions. Perhaps not the full details, but enough to understand that land, once contested, might now pass to someone outside the village bloodline. That the doctor's will was changing. That Colin, by birth, if not name, might receive something long guarded. Alistair did not speak, but his arms dropped to his sides. Gowrie had refused the McCrims an extension of their pasture. Rumors abounded that he was interested in purchasing it himself, though I believe now it was for Colin. She paused. But more than land, there was something older at work. A brother lost under Gower's care. A family pride rooted in loss. A legacy clung to like breath. The constable opened his mouth, but did not speak. The silence held. I believe MissMarple continued that Alistair confronted Dr. Gower on the cliff path, not to kill him, but to stop what he feared was being taken. She turned to him, not unkindly. Am I wrong? His jaw moved, but no sound emerged. Her breath escaped through his nose, not a denial. MissMarple's voice remained steady. In grief, we often defend ghosts more fiercely than the living. And sometimes what we defend was never truly ours. The confrontation, by every indication, was not premeditated, MissMarple said. But emotions, when mixed with memory, have a way of igniting before one means them to. She spoke not of murder, but of struggle. I believe words were exchanged, heated ones. Alice perhaps demanded answers. Gowrie, ever clinical, may have dismissed the emotional cost. Perhaps he defended his decision. Perhaps he tried to explain. But grief is not soothed by reason. She folded her hands in her lap. The fall was not calculated. There were signs. Flattened grass near the gorbush. A disturbed patch of earth near the edge. Not consistent with a simple misstep. MissMarple's tone softened. I do not think Alistair meant for it to happen, but it did. She let the words settle like ash in still air. The tragedy was not in the fall alone, but in what followed, in the need to erase, to deflect, to protect something already fractured. And so the chain was taken. And later, when Mary found it and said nothing, the fire. She looked once more at Alistair, whose face had palled to the color of salt. No denial came, only stillness. MissMarple turned next to Mary, who sat with hands folded, her chin lifted not in defiance, but in weary self-possession. I believe, she said gently, that Mary came across the chain not long after Gowrie's death, perhaps even before the constable noticed its absence. I also believe she said nothing, not to protect herself, but out of something older than guilt. Dignity. Mary's mouth parted just slightly, but she did not speak. But someone else, MissMarple continued, knew she had it or suspected. She looked now at a Leicester. You feared what it meant that someone might link you to the doctor's fall. You waited, and when time passed without resolution, you chose fire, not to harm her, but to destroy what you believed incriminated you. The constable frowned, but the fire nearly killed her. MissMarple shook her head. Alice waited until she was absent, or believed her to be. But guilt does not account for broken timmets. She returned too soon. She turned to Alistair one final time. You meant to silence a relic, but in doing so, you nearly silenced a life already made quiet by years of loss. For a long moment, Alistair said nothing. Then his shoulders, once rigid, seemed to buckle. Not dramatically, but like a tree bending under old snow. I didn't mean to. His voice, roughened by disuse, filled the room. He spoke of Hamish as though he were just another illness, a note in a ledger. I'd waited years for that conversation. And when it came It was as if my brother had never mattered. He looked not at Miss Marple, but at the rug beneath his feet. I didn't push him. I reached for him. He stepped back. It was that fast, his face. He was more surprised than afraid. He took another breath. I took the chain. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt like he left so little behind. Mary's face, inscrutable until now, softened. I saw it in her house days later. I knew it would draw attention. The fire seemed cleaner than questions. He let out a dry sound, half sigh, half laugh. I thought it was justice, not for me, but for what my family lost. But I see now, justice isn't made of silence and smoke. Miss Marple, who had known such moments before, did not speak further. The wind outside rose gently, rustling the curtains, as if carrying the final unburdening away into the hills. The kettle had long since cooled, and the wind had softened its voice to a hush that barely stirred the heather beyond the garden's low stone wall. Lavinia poured the last of the tepid tea into Miss Marple's cup, and neither seemed to mind the loss of warmth. There was a stillness that suited the end of certain stories, those that had taken root in old grief and been watered unknowingly by years of silence. "It's strange," Lavinia said quietly, her gaze lingering on a bank of low clouds clinging to the hills. "You think it will never break, that weight in the air, but then it does." Miss Marple nodded, her gloved hands resting lightly in her lap. "Grief is like that," she replied. "It lingers in corners, not always loud, but always there until it's spoken aloud or forgiven." The garden gate creaked faintly. A child's laugh echoed from far down the slope, borne on the breeze like the memory of something simpler. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "In the end," she said softly, "even the deepest wounds want sunlight." Lavinia said nothing, but her fingers, which had been tightly clasped around the cup, slowly uncurled. The solicitor's letter had confirmed it plainly. No will, no provision, no name written down in ink. Colin Fraser, son by blood, if not in word, had no legal claim to the house by the cliffs, or the parcel of land behind it. The bank account, too, lay dormant, its balance barely enough to settle affairs. And yet something curious had begun to shift, not with ceremony or proclamation, but in the way people now greeted Colin in the lane, and how Mrs. McCrimmon, Alistair's mother, had asked him, without emphasis, whether he might help with the lambing come next month. Colin had said yes, of course, not out of obligation, but because it felt, oddly, like the most natural thing in the world. He arrived early, carried feed without being asked, mended a gate with a steadiness that surprised even the dogs. No one made much of it, but when Lavinia passed him one morning and asked if he'd be staying through summer, he had nodded and smiled. A smile, Miss Marple observed, not of triumph, but of placement. It was not the inheritance of money, nor even of name, but of belonging. And in villages such as Kilbeath, that was sometimes the greater gift. As the train pulled southward and the coast fell behind her in a blur of mist and pine, Miss Marple allowed herself the rare indulgence of closing her eyes, not to sleep, but to think. It was always the same in the end. Not the crime. Those varied, but the hearts behind them. Wounded pride, old guilt, fear dressed in duty. Such things grew as stubbornly in Kilbeath as they did in St. Mary-me, as they had in Egypt during the war and in boarding schools before it. Truth she had found was never urgent. It moved like the sea, slow, persistent, and utterly indifferent to the stones placed in its path. Secrets could be buried, distorted, even passed down like heirlooms. But eventually truth would seep through the cracks, and when it came, it did not always punish. Sometimes it merely adjusted the air. She opened her eyes as the whistle blew. Her thoughts quieted, for justice had not arrived in handcuffs, but in confession, not in court, but in kitchen and field and drawing room. And that, in her quiet way, she had always trusted, because human nature, for all its frailties, still longed, however shyly, for light. And so, as the moorland wind settled once more, and silence reclaimed the hills, a truth long buried found its voice. Justice in this quiet corner of the world did not arrive in the form of handcuffs or headlines, but rather in a soft-spoken confession and a place offered to a boy who had never asked for anything. Miss Marple did not need to raise her voice or gather crowds. She simply listened, remembered, and understood what others had forgotten to see. because sometimes the answers are not hidden, merely unspoken. This tale reminds us that guilt can pass from father to son, from silence to silence, unless someone dares to look gently, but persistently into the past. And perhaps that is the greatest justice of all. Not punishment, but recognition. But what do you think? If you had discovered the truth Miss Marple did, would you have confronted Alistair? Or would you have let the past rest? Was this truly justice, or just a softer kind of consequence?